Providing insights to help you grow your business, improve yourself, and add value to those around you. You're listening to the Success is a Choice podcast, where you get a peek into the lives of industry leaders as they share their stories with you.
Hey everybody, welcome to the Success is a Choice podcasting network. We appreciate you watching this on YouTube, Rumble. Maybe you're listening to this on your favorite podcasting audio platform. Before we get into today's guest, I want to remind you that today's episode is made possible by freeleadershipworkshop.com, freeleadershipworkshop.com. Every week you can get some professional development, grow yourself, improve yourself in the areas of leadership, culture, coaching, all different kinds of things. freeleadershipworkshop.com. Well, today's guest is coming to you from Bristol, Connecticut, former ESPN producer, host, and executive producer of the Sports Spectrum podcast, author of a couple books, all around great guy, Jason Romano. Welcome to the show.
Yeah. Hey, Jamie. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Man, I appreciate you. You were a longtime guy at ESPN. You now do Sports Spectrum podcast, which is a huge show highlighting mainly Christian athletes, Christian coaches. It comes from a faith perspective. But you have some great news, fairly recently, but it's still fresh. Talk to us about some of the great, the new transition or the new stuff going on with Sports Spectrum.
Yeah, we're really excited. Back in November of 2024, we welcomed Matt Forte, two-time Pro Bowl running back, longtime Chicago Bears running back. He was also with the Jets, 10 years in the league. Second all-time leading rusher in Bears history behind Walter Payton. I like to throw that stat out. But we brought him on as a co-host and kind of lead host, really, but a co-host with me on the Sports Spectrum podcast. And I've been working on this show for 7+ years. I helped launch it. I produced it. I've hosted it for all this time, kind of by myself, although there has always been other people that have contributed and been a big part of the show. But this was a big change for us, bringing Matt on. And now I've kind of gone back to my old roles a little bit at ESPN of being a producer. I do host still. I still am a big part of the show. You'll hear my voice on it a lot. I'm still asking questions, but Matt's really the guy that I want to shine here and let him do his thing as a guy who played in the league for many years. He knows sports. He loves the Lord. And he's really good at asking questions. He's a very smart guy. So this has been a lot of fun having him on the show since we launched back in November.
Well, we mentioned executive producer, and people might hear that phrase or they might see it when they watch a movie, in the opening credits, executive producer.
Yeah.
But what most people don't realize is when they listen or watch Mike and Mike or First Take on ESPN or these shows, it's not just the talent comes in and things happen. There's people behind the scenes doing stuff. What exactly do you do when you were at ESPN as an executive producer, or even with Sports Spectrum as an executive producer?
Yeah, when I was at ESPN, I was not an executive producer. I don't want people watching who I worked with like, what is Romano doing, thinking he was an executive producer. I was not an executive producer at ESPN. I am now with Sports Spectrum. But when I was at ESPN, I was what you would just deem as a producer, which had a few different titles. I was a talent producer. I was a social media producer. I was, a radio producer. But ultimately, I tell people I was a producer. So you're behind the scenes, and there's a lot of people. At ESPN, you are working with a team, and you see, let's say SportsCenter, right? You see the two people that are hosting the show at 6 o'clock, we'll say, each weeknight. But there's a team of 15 people maybe who are working just on that show every single day. There's a coordinating producer, which would kind of be similar to an executive producer role, who coordinates the show and oversees the show. They call them the CP. And then there's a producer who is the person calling the shots on the show every single day. They're the ones that are putting the rundowns together, getting all of the video footage, the interviews, the conversations you want. And then there's associate producers that are helping to cut that video that you need and really put the show in its form and really work with the talent that are on air. You have production assistants who are kind of doing the dirty work, just coming up from college. Usually they're younger people who are learning the ropes. You have a researcher who's out there making sure all the facts are taken care of with stats and info at ESPN. You have a graphics producer. You have a technical director. You have a director in the studio. Like, there's so many people that work on just a 60-minute SportsCenter that's what's not seen. And I think a lot of us who have been in those roles as producers at a place like ESPN, we understand that we're not here to get the glory. Like, we're here to make the two people on the air shine and do the best that they can. And then also make the show as best possible as when you're watching it. And there's a lot of work. And what's funny is when I came to Sports Spectrum, I was the only guy Sports Spectrum's podcast, or even any Sports Spectrum for that matter. So what would be the equivalent of probably 5 or 6 roles at ESPN were the roles that I'm still kind of doing right now. I just have a title of executive producer, but at ESPN, you had a lot more manpower and availability from people than you do at smaller places. And I'm sure you understand that too, Jamie. Like, when we work in a smaller business, a smaller entity, a smaller ministry, you got to do more. And that's okay, because I enjoy what I get to do.
Now, were you responsible for bringing on the guest, for calling them or arranging with their people? Your people will get with my people, but you ended up being the people?
At ESPN or at Sports Spectrum? Because at Sports Spectrum, I am the people.
You are the people. But when Mike says our people will get with your people, you ended up being the people.
Yeah, I wasn't ever a booker on Mike and Mike. I was more of a social media producer, but I did book on First Take, on SportsCenter, on NFL Live, and all the NFL shows. So yes, what I would do is I would talk to the producer, or sometimes the coordinating producer of whatever show was on. Let's just say it's First Take, right? And I would work with the coordinating producer and the producer, and they would say, "Hey, Jason, we're thinking about having X, Y, and Z on. Can you go after them as guests for the shows this week?" And I say, "Yep, here we go." And so I go after the guests. Sometimes I call them directly. Sometimes I go through their PR people, their SID if it's college, or I'd even call the agent if they had one of those, or a marketing person, and I'd coordinate the interview. And you're successful. I don't know, if you get 70% of the guests that you go after, I'd say that's a really high number in the business I worked in as a booker, because I tell people all the time, I'm not the guest booker. I'm the guy that's trying to book the guests. Sometimes they say yes, sometimes they say no. I can never force anyone to say yes to come on our shows. And that goes for the shows that I work on still right now with Sports Spectrum. But I think if you have a good reputation, if people know who you are, if you've proven that you can be trustworthy and you're good at what you do, you have your stable of people that you can always go to, that when they see Jason's calling or texting or whatever, they're willing, if they're available, to say yes and come on the show. And sometimes they would say to me, "Hey, I'm looking for somebody who covers the New York Yankees. Get us somebody for 440 if you can for SportsCenter." I'd be like, "Okay." And they aren't really giving me a name or a person. They just trust me that I know that I'm going to go get somebody who will be, somebody that when you watch, they're credible. And then, whether it's a beat writer or a broadcaster that covers the team, an on-air guy, whatever it might be, a play-by-play or a color guy, a former player, whoever it is, they trusted me to get that person for them. And, sometimes I messed up and got him somebody who wasn't very good. But most of the time I really took pride in saying, "Okay, I've heard this person on air. They're actually really good, and I think they'll do well for you." And what's funny now, I look back, many of those guests that I booked way back in the day are people now who are as credible and top-notch as they come, as far as people you would watch on TV, people like Buster Olney and Jeff Passan. I remember booking Jeff Passan when he was, I think, at Yahoo like 15 years ago, and now he's the main baseball guy at ESPN. So it's kind of fun to think back to those early days, 10, 15 years ago, and some of the people that we were able to, quote unquote, discover that are now doing really great things. Dan Orlovsky's another guy that I won't take credit for, but I've known Dan since 2013, 14, when I worked with him at the broadcast boot camp. And I just saw this guy who loved football and was, ambitious and wanted to learn. And he was pretty good on TV. And now look at him. So like, I just love kind of seeing the progression of guys and gals that we talked to many years ago and seeing them thrive and doing what they're doing now.
So when you're trying to book First Take, it's like, hey, Jason, go out and get us someone that will yell really loud, has no filter, and is very confrontational.
Well, that's funny you say that, because if that was today's First Take, I'd say yes. But back in 2009, 2010, the Skip and Stephen A part of First Take was not the whole show. It was part of the show. And the outside areas within the show that were not debate were actually guest-driven conversations and topics that were talked about. And it wasn't a lot of screaming and yelling. What's funny you mentioned that, Jamie, is because I remember there was another guy who worked on First Take at that time named Jamie, who was a coordinating producer, and he had kind of come in and he was brought in to kind of fix First Take or take it to another level, I guess is probably a better word. And he went and he talked to every single producer that worked on that show. And he's like, what do you love most about this show? And I said, well, my favorite part is Skip and Stephen A. And I was not alone. I think it was 95% of the people paneled were, producer-wise that were talked to said that. And that was never a knock on the other segments. And Jay Crawford and Dana Jacobson were the hosts back in the day, and they were great at what they did. But a lot of people wanted to hear what Skip and Stephen A had to say. And thus, Jamy Bechler, Embrace Debate was born. This had to be 2010, 2011. I remember it. They said, we're going to go full time on this show as a debate show. Skip Bayless is going to be the main star. Stephen A eventually came in and he took over. And that's what this show is now. It's not my favorite cup of tea anymore, sadly, but I remember when it happened, and that was a big deal because no shows were doing anything like that, 15 years ago.
Was it actually First Take when you were doing it, or was it Cold Pizza still?
No, it was First Take. They had, so it was Cold Pizza the first year, I think, and then they decided to, or 2 years, and they decided to bring the whole staff from New York City because they had, it's kind of funny how this has all happened. They were in New York. They were paying an exorbitant amount of money to rent a studio down there. And they decided, okay, we're going to bring First Take up to Bristol. So they moved the whole show. It was Cold Pizza. They brought it to Bristol. They changed it to First Take. And it's been in Bristol, or it was in Bristol for many, many years. But then Stephen A and the success and all that, about four years ago, I think, or 3 years ago, maybe it was a little longer, they moved their operations back to New York, along with Mike Greenberg's show, Get Up, was from New York, and First Take, and they kind of developed this New York City office that they do a lot of their pregame shows around now too. So it's funny to think back though, because I remember Cold Pizza and I was like, this is kind of a fun show. It's different. Mm-hmm. It stands out as a complete opposite of SportsCenter. And then First Take came up and I started working on that show in 2008, 2009. And then to watch it go maybe a year or two later into this Embrace Debate and to see where it is now, it's kind of nuts.
Well, pretty much every day I see Jay Crawford on he's a local anchor here in the Cleveland, Akron area.
Yes.
So I watch him when I'm at the YMCA on the stationary bikes.
One of my favorite people, by the way, Jay and Dana, to this day, I haven't seen Jay a lot since, but every so often I'll pop up on social media with him. Dana, she married Sean Grandy, who's the play-by-play voice of the Boston Celtics, my favorite basketball team. So I see them on Twitter a lot, and ran into Dana a couple years ago at the Super Bowl. Two of my favorite people, Jay and Dana. I loved working with them. They were really good to us, and when I say us, I mean the producers and the people behind the scenes, and they're awesome. So
very cool. Well, you've been doing for Sports Spectrum for a long time. Great guests through the years, great shows through the years. It's a wildly popular show. I mean, relatively speaking, it's not Joe Rogan, but no one's Joe Rogan.
No,
but it's a great show, and you highlight famous athletes and coaches. You also highlight people that maybe aren't as well known, like a mutual friend of ours, Greg Tonigal, who's one of the best basketball coaches out there at any level.
Yep.
And you're able to highlight people that maybe aren't a household name, but they become more popular after your show, or people, you introduce people to different, how are you deciding who comes on your show? You're reaching out because, you're still limited on who you can bring on your show. You only
That's
have
right.
so much time. How are you deciding on that? Are you trying to purposely balance, hey, we're going to have a pro person one week, and then somebody that maybe is not, an underknown or, an underrated type coach the next week, or is there no intentionality there?
No, I think it varies. I think we're open to all different sorts of people to talk to. I'll use the example really more recently. So we're 2 shows a week, Tuesdays and Fridays, Sports Spectrum podcast releases. And, Matt, when he started in November, we had made the switch to shoot to 2 shows a week over the summer of 2024. And so when Matt started in November of 2024, that's kind of the format that we established. But, initially I was like, all right, we got Matt Forte. Let's get some pretty big name people on the show. Let's start this off right. And so you get guys from the NFL and the NBA, and you get some names that, people would heard of and have seen. But then I remember Parker Bird's name came across my email, and Parker Bird is a baseball player who is at East Carolina, right before his freshman year of college, as he's going, to sort of chase the dream of becoming a big league player someday. He has a boating accident. He loses his right leg. I believe it's his right leg. It might have been his left leg, but he loses one of his legs, and the dream is gone, right? And yet he's worked his way back to be able to still hit a baseball. And, he actually got a couple at bats, and, the East Carolina coach, gave him a shot, and that was awesome. And still honored this kid who made the commitment to play for him, to let him be a part of the team. And Parker has aspirations now to be in the Paralympics. But if I said the name Parker Bird, not many people would know who that is. But what a story. So if you actually listen, and what the rhythm that we've established with the show is this: I would always love to have the biggest names. When we talked to CJ Stroud last summer of 2024, that was a big deal for me. It was a big deal for Sports Spectrum that he said yes to come on our show. And we ended up putting him on the cover of our magazine, and it was our most listened to podcast of 2024 by far, because it was CJ Stroud. So I want to have those conversations with the biggest names. There's no doubt. But hopefully, as people are drawn into check out Sports Spectrum because of CJ Stroud, they'll be more willing and understanding and say, wait a minute, who's this Parker Bird guy? I've never heard of him, but let me listen to his story. And they're encouraged by it. So I think we're not doing anything different than most places would do, where they want to have the biggest names always. But, you mentioned Rogan, and Joe Rogan's at another level, and I do enjoy his conversation sometimes. Sometimes it's a little too much for me. But he doesn't have a lot of names that are well-known on his show. They become well-known after they go on his show. There's no doubt. Sometimes he has really big names, and sometimes he doesn't, on a much different and smaller level. That's kind of the way that we go about what we do. And that's not just athletes, it's coaches, it's broadcasters. We've had authors and pastors on. We're always trying to see what's the best conversation for what we're looking for. Sometimes it involves people who played professionally, and sometimes it doesn't. And that's okay. Just in the last few episodes, we've had Olympians on, we've had college athletes, we've had, pro athletes. We have a couple pastors coming up. We have a broadcaster coming up. We have a MLB umpire that's coming on. We have a baseball coach. So it's all different sorts of names. I'm always open. I think the one thing I want to do more of, Jamy, personally, so if you're listening and you know the best way to go about this, is kind of going into other sports that we don't touch on too much. We can become very heavy baseball, basketball, football. Mm-hmm. And rightly so, because they're the dominant 3 sports. But I want to talk to more Olympians. I want to have people in the golf space coming on, and soccer and volleyball. It's just a matter of finding the right people to have on, because, I think it's important to discern properly who you're putting on and not just have anybody. I'm not afraid to say no. A lot of people may not like that about me as a believer in Jesus. I should say, yes, every story matters. Yes, every story matters. But it's not, every story is not necessarily a fit for what we're trying to tell here on Sports Spectrum. So you just kind of balance that as best as possible.
Well, to give you a cliche question, who would you like to have on that you haven't been able to get on? Or maybe
Yeah.
you haven't even reached out to this person yet, but there's someone they're on your list, you want to get them on the show.
It's a great question because I just posed this question to my co-host, Matt Forte, last week. Like I sent him a text and I'm like, all right, we booked a bunch of guests. We've talked to a bunch of people. Who are the dream guests that you want to have on? Now, I didn't preface this by saying, let's please send me some names that I can actually reach and get on the show.
Yeah.
So he came back with Michael Jordan and Oprah and Beyonce. And I'm like, I want to talk to them too. I don't think that's ever going to happen, but we can put them on the list. So I appreciated Matt and being honest in that way. For me, I think him and I have talked about like Stephen Curry would be, I think, a really interesting guest to talk to because he's definitely a follower of Jesus and he's talked about his faith, but you don't hear him kind of pushing it out there a lot in post-game interviews, and you don't see him posting scripture every day or anything like that. So I would love to have Matt more than me, but both of us dive deeper into what does Steph Curry really believe? How does he live that out each day? What's his model? Because he's so big as far as an NBA player and all the success he's had. So he's a guy, honestly, I can't believe I'm saying this because we should have had him on by now, but it's just not worked out that we haven't been able to find a time. But Tim Tebow seems obvious, right? We do a sports and faith show. How do you not have Tim Tebow on? Tim's pretty busy, but he has not been somebody we've been able to get on yet. And I'm hoping with Matt as a co-host, some of these names that I mentioned might be a little bit more of a draw to come on and talk to. So those two for sure. And I'm sure there's more. We've been very fortunate to talk to a lot of different people that I didn't think we would ever get to talk to. My favorite guest is probably Tony Dungy. When we talk to Tony Dungy, I just always come away smiling, encouraged, and just love how that man lives out his faith and how gentle he is in the way that he does it. But there's a lot of guys and gals that I would love to talk to that we haven't yet.
Well, Tim, I know you're a big listener of the Success is a Choice podcast. You're a subscriber. Tim, go ahead and reach out.
Yes.
We'll get you.
My DMs are open. My DMs are open.
Yeah. Slide into Jason's DMs. You don't need to come on my show. I know you're a listener. We haven't hit you up.
Do both shows, Tim. Come on both shows. Come on.
Could, but go on Jason's, help a brother out. But you had on a young lady last year who I listened to that episode and I was like, I've got to get her on my show. But I already knew her because I did work with the University of Houston women's basketball team.
Oh yeah.
And I was impressed with their point guard in working with them and interacting with her. But I don't have athletes on my show. That's just been something I've not wanted to do, is have athletes on my show necessarily. I listened to her, even though I liked her. Yeah. I listened to her on your show, Layla Blair, the point guard for Houston. Listened to her on your show, and I was like, man, she's got a great story. I didn't know all of her backstory, and she was very poised. She was very mature. I was like, she is perfect to be the first student athlete to be on my show. And we had her on our show, and she's great. 4-time captain, 4-time leading scorer. But man, she's really got her head on a good head on her shoulders, as they say. So, sometimes listening to even those kind of people, you get a backstory of someone and you're like, man, it gives you kind of it gives you hope for the future. I know it's just one example, but it's like, not all student athletes are idiots or bad or, immature, because we can sometimes get, kids these days or, the NCAA athletes are going down the wrong path. And maybe there's a lot that's wrong with the NCAA, but there's also great examples of good people doing good stuff.
Yeah. Well, one thing that we just done as well, you asked me way back in the beginning of this conversation about what am I excited about and some changes. Well, we just brought on Annabelle Hasselbeck, who is Matt Hasselbeck, the quarterback. That's his daughter. 4 years she played lacrosse at Boston College and won a championship 2 of those 4. So she was pretty good at what she did, and she was on a high-level team that won a lot of titles. But Annabelle loves Jesus and is really good at cultivating conversations and doing this media thing. And we brought her on late in the summer of 24, and we helped her launch her podcast with Sports Spectrum called the What's Up Podcast. But what she does is her goal is really to feature these collegiate athletes and bridge the gap, which I think is a big one as far as athletes in the college space and even in the high school space, that audience, to understand that, hey, they have a voice, they have a story, but also they can be open and vocal about their faith as well. And so we brought Annabelle on to really, she's, I think, 23 years old, and to help. She's really sharp and super smart. And I've had an opportunity to work closely with her these last few months. And I just see so much potential, but I also see a heart to want to reach the younger people, not just for the gospel and to share Jesus with them, but also to kind of bring them in and say, hey, you can tell your story, and let them see success, to steal the title of your show, Jamie, to see success in a different way, to see success in a different way, and not just be about all the clicks and the likes and the NIL money that is just kind of blowing up right now and going crazy. But there's actually real true success underneath, what everybody else would deem as success outside in the world. So Annabelle has been a really great addition to our team as well, and we're grateful to have her.
Now, you've written a couple books, Live to Forgive, and then A Uniform of Leadership, and both of them are they're different.
They are.
They're different books, and as you think about your writings, the books you've written, they both were passions of yours. Kind of talk just a little bit through each of those, because there's a lot of people that watch the show that are readers, and they might be looking for a book to read or to give as a gift, and both of these could appeal to different sorts of people.
Yes, thank you for asking about them. So the first book I ever wrote is called Live to Forgive. I wrote it in 2018, and it's a book that's centered around the idea of forgiveness. It's really, it stemmed from my own personal journey of forgiveness and forgiving my alcoholic father for a lot of the pain that he caused for many years to me and my family. I never really wanted to write a book. I think I've told you this, Jamie, before. I don't even consider myself an author, although when you write 2 books, you're an author. But you notice I haven't written any more since my last book, and there's probably a good reason for that. It's not my favorite thing to do. But I was really encouraged and kind of convinced by a few people, and I think from the Lord as well, to just put this out there and share your story in a book form. And so I love Live to Forgive. It's the most important work that I've ever done in my entire life, and it still is to this day, because of how personal it is and because of the damage that I believe can be done when we hang on to bitterness and anger and we don't forgive. Not damage for the other person, but damage for ourselves. So that book was written specifically for people that are just struggling, which I believe is all of us in some way, with forgiving someone that's hurt us. And I wrote it from a personal perspective. It's very raw, it's very real, but it's also hopefully encouraging as well, because everybody's at a different stage of what that journey looks like to forgive. A lot of us have been hurt pretty bad, and it's hard, but I think that book, it kind of walks you through sort of a 4-step process that I walked through to get to a place where I could forgive my dad and be healed from the anger and bitterness that I had towards him. So that's the first book. That, if that's not your cup of tea, maybe leadership is. And, all of the stories and things that we shared here about ESPN, I've asked about that quite a bit. And so in 2020, which, by the way, don't ever release a book in a pandemic. I don't recommend it, but I didn't know that was happening. We wrote this book in 2019. We released it in 2020. It's called The Uniform of Leadership, and it's really lessons on true success, which is the subtitle, from my ESPN life. And, I've met and hung out with a lot of really cool people in my time at ESPN. Many you know, and many that are in that book, but a lot that you don't know, like the cashier in the cafeteria and the coworker who was a talent producer with me, who was leading Bible studies and fellowship groups, behind the scenes. I wanted to introduce the audience that would read this book to them as well, because that's life, right? Like, not all of us are hanging out with celebrities and famous people and athletes every day, but a lot of us are hanging out with the Tammys who are doing the, the cashier work in the cafeteria, or the Lisas who are doing great work as a coworker with you and just loving, encouraging others. So I wanted to feature those people as well, and really take a leadership lesson, a biblical leadership lesson from my experiences at ESPN. And that book was written specifically for teams, for churches, coaches, pastors, people who are leading a group. And it takes you through, like, each chapter has to deconstruct, what you read, and then the questions to help facilitate a group discussion. So it's really written for groups just as much as it's written for an individual. And like you said, they're two different books with two different audiences, but they're my experiences and they're my life. And so I'm very proud of both of them.
Well, the live to forgive. A lot of people may be like, well, I don't have that issue with my father, or my mother or whatever, but there's a lot of coaches watching this that have been fired, maybe even recently. And you've got a lot of bitterness. You're having a hard time moving on, or you're blaming somebody else for something that's gone on in your life, whether it's right or wrong. Yeah. There's some great lessons you could still learn from that book, even if your father or parent relationship is good. That's not the point necessarily.
Correct. It's not. It's really about encouraging people to live freedom. And how do you experience freedom? Well, I've found freedom is found in my faith, but I've found that freedom really comes when you truly learn to live to forgive, because that's what it holds us back in many ways, is when we hang on to bitterness and anger. We think we're hurting the other person when we do that, Jamie. We're actually hurting ourselves. That's the crazy thing about this anger and bitterness. And I believe you're right. It's not just people in our family, our moms or our dads or our brothers. It's coaches, it's coworkers, it's friends. It's, I saw, real quick, I'll just finish with this. I saw a clip just recently from a guy named Mark Gastineau, who was a longtime NFL defensive end. You may have seen this clip. And Mark Gastineau, runs into Brett Favre, the longtime legendary quarterback. And, Brett is thinking this is just going to be one of those reunions with a former player. Hey, how you doing? And Mark Gastineau, still 25 years later, was bitter and angry, very bitter, very angry at Brett Favre for taking a dive and letting Michael Strahan beat the sack record that Mark Gastineau had held. This is 25 years later, and he's still angry about it. And I was like, man, I need to get Mark Gastineau my book, because what are we doing that we're hanging on to bitterness? And this is not, I would say it's a different level. It's sports in that way. But he was genuinely almost moved to tears in his anger on how much that he was still mad at Brett Favre. And I'm thinking, what's the point in doing that? Like, what good did that do? That probably just ate at Mark Gastineau for 25 years, and he couldn't be able to live to forgive and move on. So that's a different kind of example, but I saw that recently and I was like, wow, bitterness can really do a heck of a lot of damage to a lot of people if they don't nail it and move on and be able to forgive.
Well, good words. We appreciate Jason Romano joining us. Follow him at Jason Romano on Instagram, on Twitter, or X. Check out his website, jasonromano.com. His books are there, podcasts. You obviously like watching podcasts, or you wouldn't be watching this right now or listening to this. So check out the Sports Spectrum podcast. Jason, we appreciate all that you are doing. For those of you out there watching this, we appreciate you for watching, listening to this. Kindly share the show with a friend, somebody that might enjoy it. And until next time, remember that success is a choice. What choice will you make?